There is a particular kind of silence that settles inside a person when they decide, very young, that certain parts of themselves must never be spoken aloud. It is not the peaceful silence of a still morning or the comfortable quiet between old friends. It is a held breath, a door locked from the inside, a whole room of yourself that you tiptoe past, pretending it does not exist. I learned that silence when I was 11 years old. His name was Marcus Webb, and he sat 2 seats ahead of me in Mrs. Patterson's 5th grade classroom. He had dark brown eyes that caught the light like river stones, and when he laughed at something, really laughed. Throwing his head back, something happened in my chest that I did not have words for. I only knew that I wanted to make him laugh like that. I wanted to sit near him. I wanted, in the wordless and electric way that children sometimes understand things before they can explain them, to be chosen by him. I told no one. Not because I understood what I was feeling, but because some instinct, older and quieter than conscious thought, told me to be still. To be careful. That instinct stayed with me for a very long time. My name is Eli Navarro. I grew up in a small city in central Texas, the kind of place where Friday nights meant high school football, where church attendance was as routine as breathing, and where the men in my family communicated mostly through jokes and silence and the shared language of working with their hands. My father, Jorge Navarro, was a good man, steady, honorable, hardworking. He coached my little league team and built a fence in our backyard with his own hands, and never, not once, in my memory, said a single cruel word to anyone in our family. But there are things that good men can make you afraid of anyway, not through cruelty, but through the architecture of their assumptions, the way my father spoke about marriage as if it were an inevitable and obvious destination, the way he teased my older brother Daniel about girls, the way the world around me made it clear, in 1,000 small and unmistakable ways, that the thing growing quietly inside me was not part of the plan. So I held my breath. I locked the door. I tiptoed past the room. I was, by almost all outward measures, a fairly normal teenager. I had friends. I played basketball through my sophomore year. I got decent grades and a part-time job at a hardware store and a beat-up Honda Civic at 16 that I was unreasonably proud of. I went on dates with girls, kind, smart girls, who deserved better than the distracted and guilty version of me they received. I smiled through family dinners and deflected questions about my love life with practiced ease. What I did not do was tell anyone about the thing. I carried the years past in that held breath way. High school became college. College, a state university 4 hours from home, became the first real breathing room I'd ever had. In that wider world, I began to understand myself more clearly. I read things. I met people. I sat one afternoon in a coffee shop and watched 2 men hold hands across a small table and felt, for the first time, not the familiar ache of wrongness, but something closer to recognition, something closer to grief. All those years of tiptoe, I thought. All those years of quiet, but understanding yourself and saying so out loud are 2 very different things. I was 23 when I came home after graduate school to help care for my mother, who had been diagnosed with a serious illness that required surgery and a long recovery. Coming home meant moving back into my childhood bedroom for what was supposed to be 6 months. It stretched, as these things often do, into something longer, and it was there, in that house, in that city, that I met Cameron Reed. He arrived on a Saturday in late September, when the Texas heat was finally beginning to relent and the light had turned that particular gold of early autumn. I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee, not really reading the book open in my lap, when the moving truck pulled up to the house next door, the one that had been empty for nearly a year since old Mr. Castillo moved to his daughter's place in San Antonio. I did not intend to stare. But then the man climbed out of the truck cab, shielded his eyes against the sun, and looked down the street with the kind of easy, unhurried attention that suggested he was someone genuinely interested in wherever he happened to find himself. He had a lean build, dark blonde hair that was slightly too long in the front, and a jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone with a strong opinion about jaws. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, and there was a small, faded scar on his chin that I somehow noticed even from across the yard. He caught me looking and raised one hand in a wave. The way people in small cities still do, the way that assumes goodwill rather than intrusion. I raised my coffee cup back, which felt immediately ridiculous. His name was Cameron Reed. I learned this an hour later when he walked over to introduce himself, not the way I might have done it. With careful social preparation and a mental rehearsal of sentences, but simply, as if it had occurred to him and he acted on it without overthinking. "Hey," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Cameron. I just moved in." He gestured over his shoulder. "Figured I should meet the neighbors before I asked to borrow something." I laughed before I meant to. "Eli," I said. "And fair warning, the Garcias on the other side have tools for everything. They're a better bet." He grinned, and something in my chest shifted in a way I recognized all too well. Cameron was 26. He had moved to town to take a position as a structural engineer at a firm that was doing a major infrastructure project in the county. He had grown up in Colorado, had gone to school in Georgia, and had lived in 4 cities in 3 years before landing here, which he described not with restlessness, but with the calm of someone who had learned to be comfortable wherever he was. Over the following weeks, we became neighbors in the best sense of the word, the kind that slides gradually into friendship, before either person quite decides it. He would wave from the driveway. I would wave from the porch. We began stopping to talk briefly at first, and then for longer stretches, leaning on the fence between our yards in the cooling evenings while the neighborhood settled into dark. He was easy to talk to in a way that I had not encountered very often. He listened, not in the polite, waiting for his turn way that some people listen, but with his full attention, with follow-up questions that proved he had actually heard you. He was funny without performing it. He held opinions firmly, but without aggression. He made coffee that was almost aggressively good, and he discovered early on that this was a reliable way to get me to come over. I told myself it was just friendship. I was very good at telling myself things. The months moved forward. My mother's surgery went well, and her recovery was slower than expected, but steady. My brother Daniel visited on weekends, and my father moved through the house with the slightly lost quality of a man who had never considered that his wife might be fragile, and was quietly rearranging his entire understanding of the world. Through all of it, Cameron was a constant. He helped with yard work without being asked. He brought over food when my mother came home from the hospital. He learned her favorite telenovela and sat with her once while I was running errands. And when I came back, she reported with great satisfaction that he had very strong opinions about whether the villain deserved redemption. "He is a good man," my mother said in Spanish, giving me a look I chose not to interpret. "He's a good neighbor," I said. She made a sound that meant she had decided not to push the matter, which was somehow worse than if she had by December. I was in the kind of situation that I had spent my adult life carefully avoiding. Deeply and inconveniently in love with a man I saw almost every day, who I could not read clearly enough to know what I was dealing with, and who had become so woven into the fabric of my daily life that losing him felt like losing a structural wall. There were moments. There are always moments. In these situations, small instances of ambiguity that the hopeful mind returns to, and examines and turns over like coins found on the street. The way he held eye contact, a beat past the usual. The afternoon he had a splinter in his palm and held his hand out for me to deal with it. And the way neither of us spoke while I worked at it with a needle, standing close enough that I could hear him breathing. A night in October, when we sat on his back steps, watching a thunderstorm roll in, and he said, out of nowhere, "I haven't had a friend like you in a long time." His voice had something in it that I did not know how to name. I did not ask. I did not say. I carried the weight of the unsaid the way I had always carried it, by becoming, if anything, more careful, more controlled, more practiced at looking perfectly relaxed while something enormous moved beneath the surface. What? I did not know was that my brother was watching. Daniel Navarro was 2 years older than me and was, in almost every way, my opposite. He was loud where I was quiet, impulsive where I was deliberate, kind of person who resolved conflict by walking directly toward it and speaking plainly. He was also, despite these qualities, or perhaps because of them, my closest friend, he had known. I understood later that he had known for a long time, not in the way of certainty, but in the way of an older brother who has watched someone he loves be careful for years and begun to wonder about the weight of all that care he came for. Christmas, we had a good dinner, my mother improving. Visibly, my father more relaxed, the house warm and noisy with family in the way I had always loved. Cameron came over for an hour with a bottle of wine and a batch of cookies that my mother declared were Mui bean, in the tone she reserved for genuine approval. And he and Daniel immediately fell into the comfortable banter of two people who like each other on first meeting. After Cameron left, I watched him go from the doorway, and I stayed there a moment longer than I needed to. When I turned around, Daniel was leaning against the wall of the hallway with his arms crossed, watching me with an expression I had never quite seen on his face before. Not judgment, not amusement. Something quieter, something careful. "Hey," he said, "come sit with me." We ended up on the back porch with beers, long after our parents had gone to bed. It was cold enough that we both had jackets on. And the neighborhood was quiet, except for someone's Christmas. Lights pulsing softly in a yard down the block. For a while we just sat. Daniel had always been comfortable with silence when it mattered, which was perhaps the one way we were alike. And then he turned to look at me and asked, very simply and very quietly, "Eli, how long have you been in love with Cameron?" I did not answer. I looked at the lights down the block. I turned the beer bottle in my hands. I felt my whole careful architecture, all those years of locked doors and quiet rooms and held breaths, tilt on its foundation. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. My voice came out flat and thin, the voice of a bad actor. "Yes, you do," Daniel said. He was not unkind. He was not pressing. He spoke the way you speak to someone who is standing on a ledge, gently, with no sudden movements, with your whole self communicating that you are not a threat. And I'm not saying this to mess with you or push you somewhere you don't want to go. I'm saying it because I love you. And because I've watched you be careful your whole life and I don't," his voice caught. Daniel Navarro, who was afraid of almost nothing, stopped mid-sentence and looked away and cleared his throat. "I don't want you to carry this alone anymore," he said. "Whatever it is, I'm your brother. You can tell me things." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I don't know how long I sat there before I spoke. Long enough that a car passed on the street out front. Long enough that I finished the rest of my beer in a single long swallow. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no great flood of words, no tearful breakdown. It came out the way a very long-held breath finally escapes quietly, gradually, and with enormous relief. "Yes," I said, "I'm in love with him. And then, I've been gay my whole life, Daniel. Since before I knew what that meant. And then, and this was the part that broke something open in me, the part I had not expected, I started to cry. Not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, with release. With the exhaustion of years of careful silence finally allowed to rest. With the ache of saying the true thing out loud to someone who loved me, someone who was sitting right there beside me on a cold December porch and not moving an inch away, Daniel put his arm around my shoulders. He didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, solid and warm and completely present, which was exactly right. "Okay," he said at last. "Just that, okay, Mom and Dad?" I started.
"I love you,"
he said. "Dad will take time. You know how he is. But he loves you, Eli. That's not going to change." He paused. "And Mom already knows." I pulled back and looked at him. "What?" He gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. "She's known for years. She told me once, maybe 3 years ago. She said she was waiting for you to be ready. Something about that, the image of my mother, quietly knowing, quietly waiting. Patient and present through all those years of my careful silence, undid me completely for about 90 seconds. I pressed my hands to my face and let it happen, and Daniel didn't make it weird. And when I came back up for air, the night felt somehow different, lighter, the way the sky looks the moment after a storm breaks. "What about Cameron?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know if he... I don't know what he is or how he feels or whether any of this is anything at all. Have you ever just talked to him? No. Have you ever given him anything honest to respond to? I thought about this. About the months of calibrated friendliness. The careful reading of his signals without offering any of my own. The way I had managed my feelings so precisely that I had become, in the space between us, essentially illegible. No, I admitted. Daniel nodded slowly. That's the thing about being careful, he said. It keeps you safe, but it also keeps you hidden. And nobody can find something that's hidden. I did not say anything to Cameron immediately. A few days passed, not in retreat, but in the slow rearrangement of understanding that happens when a room you have kept locked for years is finally opened and you have to stand in the doorway and just let the light in before you do anything else, I told my mother. On New Year's Eve, just the two of us in the kitchen while the television played in the next room. She listened to me with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on mine, and when I finished, she reached forward and held my face in both her hands. The gesture she had used since I was small when she wanted me to understand something very clearly. Mijo, she said, you are exactly who I raised you to be. There is nothing to forgive and nothing to explain, and my father took longer. There was a conversation in February that was uncomfortable and halting and did not resolve neatly. But he was there. He stayed in the room. He came back 3 days later and said, I don't understand everything, but you're my son. Which was not everything, but was enough for now. And was said with enough weight that I understood it was the beginning of something rather than the end. In all of this, in the openings and the adjustments and the slowly rearranging world, Cameron was still there, still next door, still making unreasonably good coffee, still listening with his full attention, still the same, except that now I was different, cracked open. In the way that good change often feels tender and strange and much more real than before, I began, carefully and without calculation, to be more honest with him. Not about my feelings, not yet, but about myself. I told him about growing up afraid of my own interior. I told him about the years of silence. I did not give him the conclusion. I gave him the context, and I watched him absorb it with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. I think I've done a similar thing, he said one evening. We were in his kitchen. He was cooking something, and I was sitting on the counter the way I had gradually started doing. The way you only do in spaces where you are genuinely comfortable. I came out to my family when I was 20. That was a process. But there was a long time before that where I just didn't let myself know. He paused, tasted the sauce on the stove. Or I let myself know, and then I'd put it back in the box. I went very still. He wasn't looking at me. He was adjusting the heat on the burner. It takes a while, he said, to trust that being known is safe. I sat on his counter in his kitchen while something enormous and quiet rearranged itself in my chest. Cameron, I said. Yeah, I need to tell you something. He turned then. He leaned back against the counter across from me and crossed his arms loosely and gave me that full, unhurried attention. It came out differently than I had imagined it. All the times I had not let myself imagine it. There was no rehearsed speech. There was only the truth, in the imperfect and slightly shaking form that truth usually takes when it has been kept inside for a long time. I've been in love with you, I said, since probably October. Maybe before that. And I haven't said anything because I'm very practiced at not saying things. And also because you are my neighbor and my friend, and you've been good for my family, and I didn't want to make it strange or lose what we have. I stopped. But my brother reminded me recently that hiding doesn't actually protect you. It just means you're alone with something that deserves a witness. Cameron did not move. His expression was the focused, reading carefully kind that I had come to know well. Daniel. He said, Daniel, I confirmed. The corner of his mouth moved. I like your brother, Cameron, I know, he said. I heard you. Give me a second. He was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched and stretched. And in that moment, I understood for the first time the full cost of what I had avoided for so many years, not just the loneliness of the unsaid, but the terrifying vulnerability of the said, the horrible open-air feeling of having offered the true thing and not yet, knowing what would happen to it. Then he uncrossed his arms and took 2 steps across the kitchen and stood in front of me, where I was still sitting on the counter, and we were suddenly at the same height. And he was looking at me with something I recognized because I had been feeling it for months and had been afraid to name it. "I moved 4 times in 3 years," he said quietly, "and I never once had a reason to want to stay somewhere. Until I met you." He paused. I didn't say anything either, because I didn't know if I couldn't tell. "You're very hard to read sometimes, Eli." A sound came out of me that was half a laugh and half something else entirely. "I know," I said. "I've been working on that." He reached up and put his hand on the side of my face, warm, careful, real, and said, "I'd like to see how that goes."